The more fat you have around your belly, the higher your chance of dying younger. This is what the science actually tells us. There was a large study looking at data from around 2 million people which found that every 4 inches added to your waist size was linked to an 8% higher risk of dying early for men and 12% for women. And this wasn't just a loose association either. Researchers have now shown that the relationship between belly fat and dying younger isn't just a coincidence. The fat is one of the things actively driving this increased mortality. Now, for those of you who've watched a lot of my videos so far, you'll know that I talk about visceral fat quite a bit. But honestly, I've only really skimmed over the surface of why it's so important and, more practically, how to actually get rid of it. Because reducing the size of your waist, from my perspective, isn't really about looking better, although if you feel more comfortable in your own body, then clearly that's a good thing. But what this is really about is what the research actually tells us about carrying fat around your abdomen, specifically how it affects your risk of serious disease and how long you live. Now, let me just be really clear about something from the beginning, because I know how this type of video can come across to some people. So let me just say, nobody is perfect. I'm certainly not perfect. Trying to be genuinely healthy in this modern world where most of us have jobs that have us sitting down all day for 8 or 10 hours and where we sit in cars to get there and where the vast majority of what's in our supermarkets is ultra processed while actual whole foods like veg and quality meat and nuts and seeds and fermented foods that I bang on about have become so expensive. This is really hard. But the key isn't overhauling everything overnight. It's making really small, consistent changes, building better habits gradually so that in a few years' time, you've dramatically reduced your risk of early death. So let's get into what visceral fat actually is, because most people don't really seem to know that much about it. It's not really out in the spotlight that much. We all get concerned about subcutaneous fat, the stuff that we can see. So subcutaneous fat is the stuff sitting just beneath your skin, the bit that you can sort of physically grab and pinch. It affects how you look. And honestly, some of it, particularly around the hips and the thighs, is actually metabolically protective. It's largely cosmetic. It's not the thing that's going to kill you. Now, visceral fat is completely different. It sits deep inside your abdomen. It's packed around your liver, your pancreas, your intestines. And if you've ever seen a dissection, or if you're a medical student and you've seen operations, or if you're a surgeon, then clearly you people will know what this looks like. You can't feel it from the outside. And this is the bit that catches people off guard. You can look relatively slim and still be carrying dangerous levels of visceral fat around your waist. We actually call this a term called TOFI, T-O-F-I, thin on the outside, fat on the inside. And it's far more common than most people realise. The reason it's so dangerous comes down to where it drains, which is directly into the portal vein, which is essentially the blood supply feeding straight into your liver. So your liver ends up continuously bathed in the inflammatory molecules and fatty acids that visceral fat is releasing. Now, over time, that actually drives fat accumulation in the liver itself. It raises your triglycerides, it pushes your blood pressure up, and it creates exactly the hormonal environment where insulin resistance takes hold. It releases its own inflammatory chemicals, what we call cytokines, and that drives the kind of chronic low-grade inflammation linked to heart disease and cognitive decline and certain cancers as well. Now, the Framingham Heart Study, which is this big piece of research, one of the longest running cardiovascular studies ever conducted, and you can search for this online, it's quite well known. What it found was that visceral fat predicted heart disease outcomes completely independently of overall body weight. And UK Biobank data consistently shows that waist circumference is a better predictor of metabolic disease and early death than BMI. We know that BMI isn't great. Your BMI doesn't tell you where your fat is sitting, but your waist does. Now, there's a dominant idea around fat loss that's true but sort of badly incomplete. And that incompleteness is exactly why so many people lose weight and still end up in serious trouble 15 years down the line. The message is eat less, move more, create a calorie deficit. And look, energy balance is real, it matters. I'm not dismissing that, but visceral fat is hormonally driven. It responds to insulin levels, to stress hormones, to how well you're sleeping, to alcohol intake, to how much you're moving across the entire day. You can eat less, you can lose weight, yes, that's true, but still have chronically elevated insulin quietly driving central fat accumulation. The number on the scale goes down, but the dangerous stuff doesn't. So the reframe that I want you to get hold of throughout this entire video is that the goal isn't necessarily weight loss. The goal is metabolic restoration. Weight loss, when it happens, is a byproduct of getting that right. So let's go into the 9 steps then. So step 1 is lower your insulin first. This is where I'd start with almost every patient because visceral fat is exquisitely sensitive to insulin. When insulin is chronically elevated, which happens when you're regularly eating refined carbohydrates and ultra-processed food and drinking liquid sugar, whether that's Coke or smoothies or other protein shakes, visceral fat expands. When insulin comes down, visceral fat is preferentially mobilized. Your body starts burning that first. This is one of the most well-replicated findings in all of metabolic research. So the first lever is reducing insulin, not just calories. Now, practically, that starts very often with liquid sugar, like I've just mentioned. So fruit juice, smoothies, fizzy drinks, sweetened tea and coffee, frappuccinos, all of these sorts of things. These produce a rapid insulin spike with essentially no signal telling your brain that you're full. They are metabolically very expensive and they're not filling you up. From there, the next logical step would be to start reducing the rest of your ultra-processed food intake, not because of vague clean eating principles, but because these foods are specifically engineered to drive overconsumption and they keep insulin elevated throughout the day. The next thing is to think about increasing your protein, targeting around 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilo of body weight, although there is some disagreement on the exact number. And the reason protein is so important is because it's the most filling macronutrient and it has a much more modest effect on insulin compared to refined carbs. The other thing is increasing your fiber intake dramatically. Most people are eating around 15 grams a day when the target should really be 30 to 40. What fiber does is that it slows glucose absorption down and directly improves insulin sensitivity over time. The PREDIMED trial, which I've mentioned before, showed that a Mediterranean eating pattern reduced major cardiovascular events by around 30%. The DIRECT trial demonstrated that reducing carbohydrate intake produced a really big reduction in liver fat, sometimes within weeks. These aren't small effects. You're not trying to lose weight necessarily, you're trying to improve how your body handles insulin, and the fat responds to that. Step number 2 in our 9-step plan today is resistance training, and this has to be non-negotiable. So people almost always go straight to cardio when they want to lose fat, and I get that, I understand why, but for visceral fat specifically, resistance training, so lifting weights, building strength, is arguably more important. Multiple meta-analyses show that resistance training reduces visceral fat independently of changes in the weight on the scale. You can lose visceral fat without the number on the scale moving much at all, purely through the metabolic effects of building muscle. And the reason is fairly straightforward. So muscle is the primary place in your body where glucose gets cleared from the bloodstream. More muscle means your body disposes of glucose more efficiently, which means lower insulin levels are required, which means less drive to accumulate visceral fat. The relationship here is direct and it's significant. Now, there's also a mortality angle worth mentioning here really quickly. So grip strength and overall muscle strength predicts lifespan better than BMI across virtually every population that's been studied. Strength is a proxy for your metabolic reserve. It tells you something about how well the whole system is functioning. The minimum you need, I would say, is 3 to 4 sessions per week. Now, they don't need to be long, but they need to be built around these big compound movements that recruit lots of different muscles at once, like squats or deadlifts or presses or rows. And you need to be increasing the weight gradually over time, what we call progressive overload. You don't need to become a power lifter or a bodybuilder. You need to be consistently stronger than you were 6 months ago. And if you're losing weight but getting weaker, then you're losing the wrong thing. You're losing muscle, which is the very thing that keeps your metabolism working properly. So keep the protein high and keep on lifting. And this leads me straight on to number 3, which is protecting your muscle while you're losing fat. So this is the part that most fat loss advice skips entirely. And it's the part that determines whether your results actually last. So when people lose weight without paying attention to protein or resistance training, a significant portion of what they lose is muscle. And losing muscle is metabolically catastrophic in slow motion. Your resting metabolic rate drops, your body burns fewer calories at rest, and the deficit that was producing results stops working. You eat slightly more because you're hungrier, because your hormones are pushing you that way, and the fat comes back faster than before. Now, this isn't a willpower problem necessarily. This is what happens when you lose weight the wrong way. And this is what we see when people are on these weight loss jabs. They lose weight so quickly, but they lose so much muscle at the same time. And going back to what we've just covered, less muscle means worse glucose disposal, which means higher insulin, which means more visceral fat accumulation. It cycles in exactly the wrong direction. Now, the fix here is prioritizing protein consistently. 1.6 grams to 2.2 grams per kilo of body weight daily, spread across meals from whole food sources where possible. Try to avoid shakes if you can. And maintaining resistance training even while you're eating in a deficit. Muscle is your metabolic insurance policy. If you don't protect it deliberately, then fat loss will simply take it away from you. Step number 4 is zone 2 cardio, which rebuilds your metabolic engine. And this is so important for anybody that wants to live a long and healthy life. So visceral fat accumulation correlates really strongly with mitochondrial dysfunction. Mitochondria are the tiny structures inside your cells that produce energy. And in people with high amounts of visceral fat, with a big waist, they tend to be less efficient, less numerous, and less capable of burning fat as fuel. Zone 2 cardio directly targets this. Zone 2 is aerobic work at a conversational pace. You're working, but you can still speak in full sentences without gasping. Now, this could be on a treadmill, on a slight incline, it could be on an exercise bike, it could simply be walking outside, but going fast enough that you feel like you're working hard, getting a bit of a sweat on, but you can still talk to your friend next to you. Now, in metabolic terms, it's the intensity that most effectively stimulates fat oxidation and drives the creation of new mitochondria. Over time, it improves your body's capacity to use fat as fuel. It reduces liver fat, it improves insulin sensitivity, and it raises your VO2 max, which is your maximum aerobic capacity, essentially how efficiently your body uses oxygen during exercise. And VO2 max is one of the strongest predictors of all-cause mortality that we have in the medical literature. It's stronger than blood pressure, it's stronger than most routine blood markers. A low VO2 max is a serious independent risk factor. Now, zone 2 training is the most direct way to move that. 2 to 3 sessions a week, 30 to 45 minutes if you can, at a pace where you could hold a conversation. It's not glamorous, sometimes it can be a bit boring, but it's enormously effective over time. And if you're sedentary, if you spend most of your day sat down, then this could really help you. Step 5 is all about your sleep, and most people know that sleep is important, or at least you should do if you've watched any of my other videos. But I don't think most people understand just how specifically and directly poor sleep drives visceral fat accumulation. The way this works is that sleep restriction raises your cortisol. It elevates something called ghrelin, which is the hormone that makes you hungry. But poor sleep also suppresses something called leptin, which tells you that you're full and directly worsens insulin sensitivity. Now, there are controlled studies where people were put on identical calorie deficits, but one group had their sleep restricted, and they lost significantly less fat and significantly more muscle than the other group who were sleeping normally. And this is because sleep deprivation fundamentally changes your hormonal environment. And chronic sleep deprivation preferentially increases your central fat. This is what the studies show specifically. And the practical system here is this: a fixed sleep and wake time every day, 7 to 8 hours protected as a genuine priority. Bedroom temperature around 18 degrees Celsius, which sounds oddly specific, but it's based on the core temperature drop your body needs to initiate deep sleep. And then also a real boundary around stimulating content in the 90 minutes before bed. Not because screens are inherently evil, but because of what they do to your arousal state right before you're trying to sleep. The goal is to try and become an expert sleeper and put as much emphasis on your sleep as you do with your diet and exercise. Number 6 is all about alcohol now. So I'll say this quite plainly because it often gets softened more than it should be. So when you drink alcohol, your liver makes processing it the priority. Everything else, including fat oxidation, gets paused while the alcohol is dealt with. Liver fat accumulates, triglycerides rise, and because alcohol calories arrive with essentially no satiety signal, they tend to stack on top of your normal intake rather than replacing anything. Even moderate regular drinking, the amount that most people consider completely normal, is associated with increased waist circumference and elevated liver fat in the population level data. So if you're someone who has a glass of wine every night after work or a couple of cans of lager after work, then this is for you. You cannot outtrain regular alcohol consumption when visceral fat is your target. It directly promotes the metabolic environment in which visceral fat accumulates. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody needs to be permanently abstinent, but it does mean that this variable needs to be taken seriously rather than rationalized away. Now, number 7 is something that I've mentioned a fair few times in other videos, but I don't really think people take it that seriously. But it's all about chronic stress, and it's really, really difficult in this day and age with all of the pressures that everybody has. It's hard to deal with directly, but let's just talk about it anyway. Most people know that stress is bad for them in a general sense, but the specific mechanism here is really worth understanding for most people. So when you're chronically stressed, and I mean the ongoing low-level psychological stress of modern working life, not the acute physical danger sort of stress, your body runs an elevated cortisol signal for extended periods. Visceral fat tissue has an unusually high density of cortisol receptors, which means it's specifically responsive to chronic stress in a way that other fat stores simply aren't. Now, cortisol promotes fat storage centrally. Stress literally shows up on your waistline. Now, people may have heard of something called Cushing syndrome, which is a condition of pathological cortisol excess. And this produces a dramatic central fat accumulation. And it's essentially an extreme version of what chronic stress does more slowly to everybody else. Just Google Cushing syndrome and you'll see what I mean here. Now, managing this means building actual recovery into your life. Things like daily walking, not as a structured exercise necessarily, but as a genuine decompression. Proper psychological detachment from work with real periods where the inbox stays closed, where you don't check WhatsApp or your emails. Another thing I've mentioned in the past is breath work, which has really good evidence for reducing activation of the stress response system and also reducing the constant low-level stimulation of news and social media, which is always negative these days, which keeps your threat detection system quietly activated for hours at a time, without you even realizing it. Moving on to the penultimate step in our list today, and this is all about something that not many people have heard of, but I think is one of the most important things in metabolic health these days. And I think in a couple of years, we'll be talking about this a lot more. This is non-exercise activity thermogenesis, NEAT. And this is everything you burn outside of formal exercise. So walking, standing, fidgeting, moving between tasks, just standing up doing the washing up, hoovering or polishing or whatever you do at home. Now, the reason this is important is because the research shows variation of up to 2,000 calories per day between individuals from NEAT alone. Not from different gym programs, just from how much people move in ordinary life. 2,000 calories. Now, if you've got somebody who is sat down most of the day in the car, then in the office, then in the car coming back home, then on the sofa, and you've got somebody like a builder or an elderly person who is gardening all day or cooking and cleaning, that's potentially 2,000 calories difference. It's crazy to think about. And the important thing here is that visceral fat correlates really strongly with sedentary time, independently of whether someone exercises or not. As I mentioned before, you can train for an hour and then sit completely still for the rest of the day, the next 15 hours. And the metabolic consequences of all of that sedentary time isn't cancelled out by that gym session in the morning. Your body doesn't work that way. If you do a workout in the morning, but then you sit all day, you are sedentary. Even though you might be quite fit, you're a sedentary person still. Now, the practical target is to aim for anywhere between 8 to 12,000 steps daily as a baseline, and also to walk after everything you eat. This has really solid evidence behind it for blunting the blood sugar spike that follows eating, and it's one of the most effective and underused blood sugar management tools available to anyone. And the other thing is to break up prolonged sitting wherever you can during the day. And this could be walking while you're taking phone calls, or simply setting an alarm for every hour and doing 30 squats at the desk while you're at work. Now, this isn't really exercise, it's just movement. It's just replacing the stuff that we used to do 50 years ago before modern life took over. And the metabolic return on this is far larger than most people realize. And finally, step number 9, which is all about measuring the right things. Now, your bathroom scales are honestly one of the most unuseful things to measure visceral fat specifically. Weight can stay almost the same while visceral fat falls significantly because you're building muscle at the same time. Weight can drop while visceral fat barely shifts because you're losing it from the wrong places. The better measurement is your waist circumference measured with a tape measure. Consistent, same point at the same time of day, with a waist to height ratio below 0.5 being the target that most metabolic health researchers use. If your waist is less than half your height, then you're in reasonable metabolic range. And what this means is that your waist in centimeters should be less than half your height in centimeters. So if you're 180 centimeters tall, your waist should ideally be below 90 centimeters. If you're 160 tall, then it should be below 80. Now, beyond that, there are some blood markers that are worth knowing about. Fasting insulin is rarely measured in standard health checks, but it's one of the most informative early signs of metabolic dysfunction. It often starts rising years before your blood glucose shows anything abnormal, so it catches problems much earlier. Triglycerides are also worth checking too, as these tend to rise when visceral fat is accumulating. Now, some of you may have heard of something called ALT. Now, ALT is a liver enzyme blood test that creeps up as fat builds in the liver. And it's one of the earliest signals that visceral fat is becoming a problem. And if you can, try and get your doctor to run something called a HOMAIR or HOMA-IR, which stands for Homeostatic Model Assessment of Insulin Resistance. But essentially what it does is take your fasting insulin and your fasting glucose, combine them into a single number, and use that to estimate how hard your body is having to work to keep your blood sugar under control. The higher the number, the more insulin resistant you are, and the more likely visceral fat is driving metabolic damage behind the scenes. The point is that visceral fat loss tends to show up in your waist before your weight, and in your blood results before your appearance. So measure the things that actually reflect what's happening underneath, not just the number on the scales. And look, depending on where you are in the world watching this, some of these blood markers your doctor might not be able to run for you. So it's sometimes worth considering going privately to get a fuller picture. We all spend money on cars and gadgets. Some people buy really expensive supplements every month trying to be healthier. So actually spending some money on tests that tell you precisely what's going on inside your body could be one of the best investments you make in your own health. Now, I can't recommend any specific clinics, unfortunately, but if you search for private metabolic health testing or private blood testing in your area, then there are clinics that will run all of these markers for you and give you a proper breakdown of the results. And it's worth saying that I don't get any money for suggesting that to you. This is completely just my personal advice. And finally, to close, let me just bring this back to where I started. In nearly a decade of emergency medicine, I never looked at a cardiac arrest and thought it came from nowhere, in the vast majority of cases anyway. These things don't come from nowhere. They come from decades of silent metabolic damage that nobody caught early enough or took seriously enough to reverse. Now, visceral fat around your belly is silent, but it's inflammatory, it's progressive, but it is also reversible. And that last part is the most important thing in this entire video. You don't need extreme dieting. You don't need to spend 2 hours in the gym every day. You just need a system that lowers your insulin, builds and preserves muscle, develops aerobic capacity, gets you fit, and protects sleep, and reduces alcohol, and increases daily movement, and manages your stress. If you do all 9 of those consistently, then visceral fat will shrink as a consequence of your metabolic environment improving. You do not need the supplements that other YouTube doctors are trying to sell you. You just need the boring, basic stuff that has lots of evidence behind it. I really hope you got some useful tips from this video today. If you did, then please give it a like and subscribe to the channel to make sure you don't miss a single video. And I'll see you next time.